Again, here we are back talking about CSS together, and in the last couple videos we covered setting font styles, and we've been working on our CSS Zen Garden page. I'm at the lesson page here, and at the bottom here I have some information on CSS units. So we're not going to cover all of this today because they apply to so many different things. It's hard to fit them all into just the font stuff that we're working on. But we will look at them right now, and then we'll come back and we'll revisit some of these in the future too, because they apply more sometimes to different properties than we're using today. So CSS is actually kind of amazing because of the number of units that it uses and the way that it handles those units. It's actually, like more involved than you'd think, right? Because, essentially CSS allows you to mix units. So you can take, inches and centimeters and millimeters and pixels and put them all together, and CSS will convert them all to a common unit and then do all the math to make them work together, okay? Like if you had to do that, it'd be very difficult, right? So what kind of units do they give us, right? Well, they give us a set of absolute units, right? So these are always the same size, whenever you use them, right? So for example, centimeter is always a centimeter. I guess it's 25/64 of an inch, right? Millimeter, right? It's always 1/10 of a centimeter, right? A Q, I didn't even know this one. I just found this one, right? I guess it's 1/40 of a centimeter for some reason, right? And then there's an inch, and then there's picas, points, and pixels, right? So, typically on the computer we're using pixels, right? But you never know, like centimeters might be good. If you know something needs to be 1 centimeter, you can use it, right? Let's give it a try, right? So I like my headline here, but let's imagine that I also wanted to be able to print this page. And if somebody printed it, I wanted to know how large things were. So, the headline here could be, oops, let me set the H1 there to font size of 1 centimeter. Now it's exactly 1 centimeter, right? 1.5 centimeters, right? Which should be the same as, what is that, 15 millimeters, right? So we can use absolute units, right? You could set inches. Picas, points, and pixels are technical measurements for type on the computer, right? I think picas actually come from print, right? But I'm not sure. Points are like old school pixels. So in the past, like older monitors were always always had 72 pixels for every inch. Newer monitors have variable pixel size, or the pixels, they don't change sizes, but different monitors have different pixel densities, right? So now the common measurement is 96 pixels per inch. So that's like the new pixel, and points are kind of like the old pixel, right? But either one of these is good. Pixels, I like this number. I don't know, it makes sense to me, so I use this a lot, right? So next we get into relative units, right? And these are a little harder to understand, but essentially they're relative to something else, right? So the common one that we have here is M. So an M is the font size of the parent element, right? So in our case, like if you set the font size on the body, the body is the parent of all the other elements, right? Or really it's the ancestor, right? But if one element is a child and it inherits the font size from the body, then its children inherit the font size from it, right? So essentially setting the font size here on the body means that anything inside the body where you set the font size to an M measurement, it'll be a multiple of the font size from the body, right? Let's give that a try. So let's imagine I have the font size here on the body of 18 pixels, and when I do that, I've got font size here, and so wrapper will inherit font size. It'll be parent to section intro, which will inherit the font size, and then header banner will inherit the font size, and then the H1 right here will look up at its parent and use the font size from the parent, right? So let's give that a try. So let's imagine that I wanted this heading right here to be exactly 36 pixels tall. So I could make it 2M. Okay, so now it should be 32, right? If I wanted to make it, 3 times 18, I could do 3Ms. Okay, so that works pretty good, but let's imagine that I needed to, and this is where M's, like we're going to talk about another unit here called a rem, right? It's called a root M, okay? And so this one works a little bit different. So I'm going to talk about M's first, and then we'll talk about the rem, okay? So let's look here. So let's imagine I wanted this whole top section to be a larger font size than the rest of the page. So that whole section there is this thing right here called the intro, right? No, actually, my mistake. It's really what I want to get is I want to get these two paragraphs right here, or I want to get this heading and this paragraph. So I want to get summary because I want the text here to be larger, right? Well, actually, no, I guess let's include Road to Enlightenment. So we'll do this whole section. So I'm going to grab this whole section right here, and I want it all to be lighter. So it's going to be everything from here on up to the top, right? So let's go down here, and I'm going to say dot intro. Everything there is going to be font size. And let me take the font size off of, before we continue here, let me remove the font size on the H1. So this is what we had to start with, but I want this whole section here to be larger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the bottom here on intro and set font size to be, we'll start with 2M, right? So this whole section now is going to be twice as large, right? Maybe that's a little too much. Let's make it 1.5, right? Okay, right? So I've got 1.5M. So this whole first section is larger, right? Now, the type here didn't change size, okay? Because if I look at the H3 right here, the font size is set to 3 rems. Okay, so if I set the font size to an M, let's actually move this up here above that H3 so we can see the two together. There we go, right? So now we can see these two items together. We can see that everything in here is going to be twice what it normally would be, right? It's going to be 2 times the inherited font size, or 1.5 times, right? The H3 is using a rem, so this is going to be a root M, and instead of looking at its parent element up here and being, I'm going to be, whatever this number is, 1.5 times 18 would be 27, right? So instead of being 27 rems times 3, it's going to look at the font size of the root element of 18 and be 3 times 18, right? So it's that 48 or 40, wait, 3 times 30 plus 24, 54, right? Okay, right, so this one's going to be 54, right? If I wanted this one to also scale relative to its parent, then instead of using a root M, I could use a regular M, right? So now this is like a lot larger because it's going to be 3 times the 27, right? Maybe that's too big. Let's do 2 M's, right? Okay. So the M is, number, or think of it as a multiplier times the parent element, like the font size of the parent, right? So it multiplies the font size. And a rem is the a multiplier of the font size based on the font size of the root element. Okay, if that makes any sense there, right? Okay, or hopefully it makes sense, right? So anyway, so we got M's and rems. So usually when we're talking about fonts, M and rem are actually, they come back from old school typography, and these are units that are based on the size of the font. So M gets its name because it's based on the width of the largest character, right, which is the letter M in the in the alphabet, right? Okay. There's a couple other units here that are interesting, right? So some of these, like this EX and CH, like I've never even used those, right? LH, interesting, right? Then we get into viewport width, viewport height, uh, view min, and view max, right? So these are interesting because they're based on the size of the window, right? So the VH and Vmin and Vmax and VW are all based on how big the window is, right? Let's give that a try just for fun. I'm going to remove, well, maybe I'll just leave that, right? So I'll just leave that right there. Let's focus on this heading element right here. So that's our H1. I'm going to go find that, have it right here, right? So there's our H1. Let's imagine I wanted this to change size based on the size of the window, right? You know, and that might be good for some responsive design. Usually I wouldn't do this, right? It's not a good idea to have the fonts change size, right? But it might be good for some cases, especially for something like a heading, right? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the font size here, and I'm going to change it. Well, you can play with this, but I'm going to do, let's do it as 1 VW, okay? Right? So it should be 1% of the size or the width of the window. And you can see as the window gets wider, the text gets larger or smaller, right? So as I make the window wider, the text gets larger, right? We could set it to, you know, let's say 2% the size of the window, and then it'd be a little bigger, you know, and it would scale up, right? Or 3 times, right? Now, notice that when I change the height of the window, it doesn't change the size of the text, right? So maybe, you know, I want this to change based on, you know, how big the window is, the area of the window. So if it changes height and width, you know, I want to pick the larger of the two numbers. And that's what the, what this unit over here does, right? Let me go find that unit again. So VH and VWidth are 1% of the height and width of the window. Vmin and Vmax give you 1% of the smaller dimension, right? So if the width is smaller than the height, then you get 1% of the width. If the height is smaller than the width, then you get 1% of the height, okay? So we can switch this to Vmin, and we can be the minimum size of the viewport, right? Okay. Vmax gives you the larger dimension. Okay. So we can switch this to Vmin, and now the size here is going to be based on both the width and the height. So you can see as the height is changing, it changes, but as soon as the width gets to be wait, let me change it like this. I guess let me rearrange. Yeah, there you go. Right. So it depends like on which is larger, right? So if the width is larger, it's going to use the height. If the height is larger, it's going to use the width. Okay. So anyway, so there's a little look at the units in CSS, right? And there's a whole bunch more of these. You really don't use these in practice. Probably the most practical units are, you know, are pixels, M and rem, and then the VW, VH, Vmin, and Vmax are pretty useful in some cases, right? And the rest of these I really don't use very often, though, you know, I could see some use for centimeters and millimeters, believe it or not, right? If, you know, you can print your web pages and maybe that's useful for people, or you want to create something that people can print easily, and they can just choose the print option up here on the menu. And, you know, if you want to size things, you can use, you know, real world units for that, right? Also note that you can create a style sheet for print. So you can target print as a style, so you can actually have styles that, you know, rearrange your page and resize things to other units. So you can have, you know, a style that's just good for the computer screen, and then a style that's good when you print your page too. So it's pretty powerful. Anyway, thanks for watching and have a great day, and I hope you can apply these to your Zen Garden page.